Welcome back. We now have unhighlight and highlight inventory slot functions, and these are designed to broadcast a delegate. So here's highlight inventory slot, and it's broadcasting the inventory slot to play the icon animation at, an unhighlight inventory slot, and that's going to pass the highlighted slot and false so that we can stop playing the animation and set our currently highlighted slot variable called highlighted slot to -1, and that way we'll know that we're not highlighting a slot. Now in this video, we're going to assign an event to that delegate to respond to when we call that in C++. So let's go to the HUD folder, and we're going to do this in inventory bar. So here's our inventory bar widget blueprint. I'm going to go over to the graph, and here's our event graph. Here's event construct, which gets called at the beginning of the game, and we set our variables here, and we also bind an event to equip item delegate. This is also where we're going to bind an event to our highlight icon delegate. So we're going to go ahead and do this off of our shooter character reference. We have a shooter character, and we're going to get that from our My Blueprint tab. We're going to drag that out and get shooter character. And from shooter character, we're going to drag off of this, and we're going to say highlight icon delegate. And here we can choose assign highlight icon delegate. Select that, and now we have a custom event created and assigned to highlight icon delegate. Now we need to connect this execution pin, and we're getting kind of in the way of the other nodes here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this all the way out here so that we have our own room. And I'm going to rename this custom event to highlight icon event. Highlight icon event. So highlight icon event receives our slot index and a Boolean for whether or not we should start the animation at that slot. And the animation is the icon animation we created in weapon slot. If we go back to the designer and press play, it's this square shrinking with the arrow icon. So here in inventory bar's event graph, how are we going to implement this? Well, I'd like to create a function that will handle what we need to do. And that function is going to take the slot index and the Boolean for whether or not we should start the animation. So let's go ahead and create a new function. So add new and function, and let's call this play highlight animation. So play highlight animation. Now we can go ahead and add two input parameters. The first one will be an integer, and I'm going to call this integer slot index. And I'm going to add another parameter. This one will be a Boolean, and I'm going to call this start animation. So now we have a slot index and start animation. Now we can go back to our event graph, and we can simply drag in play highlight animation and call this function, passing in slot index and start animation. So now all we need to do is implement this function play highlight animation right here. Now before we implement this, we need to go back to our weapon slot and take this highlight border and arrow icon, and we need to set these to hidden at the beginning of the game. So let's go to the event graph, and right here click on the event graph tab. We have the event construct. This is again like the begin play for our weapon slot widget. Now we're going to get our highlight border. So right here in my blueprint, highlight border. If you don't see it here, then you may have forgotten to make this a variable. So go back to the designer and click on highlight border, and up here in details, make sure is variable is checked. And for that matter, double check that arrow icon has is variable checked as well. Now back over to the graph, we have highlight border and arrow icon because those are variables. And we need to set these to hidden in event construct. So drag out highlight border, get highlight border, and drag off of this and type set visibility. And a set visibility node allows us to set the visibility, and we can change the visibility with this drop down. We're going to set it to hidden. And we're going to do the same thing for the arrow icon. So drag that out, get arrow icon, set visibility, and let's choose hidden and connect that up. So now these will be invisible by default. So we can compile and save this. Now I clicked compile and it looks like I'm getting a can't connect pins error. Go ahead and click on that, and here it's saying that these are incompatible, and that's because when making changes sometimes these connections can be broken. Sometimes we can right click and refresh nodes, and even though it breaks the pin, we can now hook that back up and compile and save it. So that's a pretty easy fix when we see that error. So now our weapon slot starts out with the square and arrow both invisible. They're both hidden from the start. Now back in inventory bar, we're ready to play the highlight animation. Now the highlight animation depends on the slot index because we want to play the animation for that weapon slot at the particular slot. So what we need to do is switch. So we're going to type switch on int, and this takes the slot index and it performs a switch just like a C++ switch statement. Now since we're going to have multiple different cases and we're going to want to use our start animation boolean to decide what we're going to do, just so we don't have so many wires crossing, I'm going to take this start animation and store it in a local variable. So I'm going to add a new local variable. It's going to be a boolean, and I'm going to call this start anim. And I'm going to go ahead and alt click and drag to get a setter, and I'm going to set start anim with our start animation input parameter. Now what are we going to do with our switch on int? Well, if we click to add a pin, then we have the 0 case here. That's going to be for when our slot index is slot 0. So let's just handle this case for now. So 0 is going to be our default weapon. So let's go up to default weapon slot. Drag that out and get default weapon slot. And that's our default weapon slot. Now what do we want to do with default weapon slot? Well, for one, it depends on the value of start anim. If we get start anim here, then we can create a branch and plug start anim in for that, like that. And if start anim is true, then we want to play that icon animation. So if we have a weapon slot, we can access the weapon slot's variables. Which variables do we want to access? Well, we want to come back over here and get our highlight border and our arrow icon and set those back to visible. So off of default weapon slot, let's drag off and type arrow icon. We'll get the arrow icon first, and we'll go ahead and set the visibility to that. So set visibility, and we'll set it to visible, and we can hook this up. Now we also want to get that border, which is called highlight border, and so we can drag off of the default weapon slot and we can say highlight border, and we can get highlight border, and we're going to drag off of that and set visibility to visible for this one as well. So first, that's what we need to do, is set the visibility for the arrow icon and the highlight border. Next, what we want to do is actually play the animation. So for the default weapon slot, we're going to drag off of that and we'll get the animation. And we can do this because if we go back to weapon slot and select highlight animation, remember up in the details panel we checked is variable. So this animation is a variable, which means we can access it here. So we have our default weapon slot. We're going to drag off of this and we're going to get that animation. We called it highlight animation. So let's get highlight animation. Now, if we have highlight animation, we can simply drag off of this, type play animation, and use a play animation node. We can hook that up, and we're simply calling play animation. So that's what we need to do if start anim is true. But what about if start anim is false? Well, then we need to stop playing the animation. So the first thing we need to do is we can get our highlight animation, which we have right here. We can click and drag off of that, and we can type stop animation. So that stops the animation from playing. So we're going to hook up the false case up to that. And also we want to set our arrow icon and highlight border to hidden. So let's go ahead and drag off of the arrow icon and use a set visibility node, and we can set this to hidden. So we'll hook that up, and we'll go ahead and take the highlight border and use a set visibility node for this one, and also set this one to hidden. So basically we have two cases when start anim is true and when start anim is false. When it's true, we take our arrow icon and highlight border, set those to visible, and then we play our animation. But when start anim is false, then we take our arrow icon and highlight border and we set those to hidden right after calling stop animation for the highlight animation. Now this is a lot of nodes for just the case where our integer for the slot index is 0. So this will be a lot better if we go ahead and make a function that will do all this. And the function can simply take an input parameter for the weapon slot, that's that weapon slot widget blueprint, and the highlight animation. And of course we can take in a Boolean for start anim as well. So let's go ahead and create a function that will do all this so we don't have to copy and paste all these nodes. So right here, I'm going to click add new and I'm going to select function. And for this function, let's go ahead and call this start icon anim for start icon animation. And we'll add some inputs. I'm going to add a new input parameter, and I'm going to make this for the type called weapon slot. That's our weapon slot widget blueprint. It's going to be an object reference. And I'm also going to add a new input parameter, and this one will be of type widget animation. This is a widget animation object reference. Now for the weapon slot, I'm just going to call this weapon slot. And for the widget animation, I'm just going to call this animation. And finally, I'm going to add a new parameter, and this will be of Boolean type, and this will be called play anim. You can call it play anim, start anim, it doesn't matter. So start icon anim is going to do what we just did right here. It's going to take all these nodes, and so I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this and go into start icon anim and paste it here. And instead of default weapon slot, I'm going to simply take our weapon slot input and plug it into the get arrow icon. I'm going to plug it into the get highlight border. And instead of using the highlight animation from our default weapon slot, I'm going to get the animation input parameter and drag this over to play animation. And I'm also going to get this animation input parameter and drag it into stop animation. Now we don't need default weapon slot or that highlight animation. All we need are the input parameters. And instead of start anim here, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to use our input parameter play anim here. And then I'll simply plug in our execution wire to the branch, and now we have our function. So we have quite a bit of wires here, and it's looking a little spaghetti-ish, but that's okay because this is really all we need to do for this function. If you want, you can add some reroute nodes or create some local variables to eliminate those crisscrossing wires, but it's not really necessary, so I'll leave that up to you if you want to do that. So we now have start icon anim. Now back in our play highlight anim function, when we switch on int, now all we need to do is call our start icon anim function. We don't need all of this business. So go ahead and delete that. And from our 0 case, we're going to call start icon anim. And this simply takes a weapon slot, an animation, and a Boolean. So for the 0 case, we're going to use the weapon slot called default weapon slot. We're going to use the animation from the default weapon slot. And remember, we called this highlight animation. So we're going to get the default weapon slot, drag off, type highlight, and get highlight animation. and we're going to plug that in. And we have this variable called start anim that we created. It's a local variable. We're going to plug that right here into play anim for start icon anim. So this is a lot better looking than what we had before. Now, when we switch on the int, we're going to switch for the entire inventory. And if you go back to the designer, you'll see that we have slot 0 for the default weapon and slots 1 through 5 for the rest of the inventory. So we're going to add pins here until we have 5 integers to switch on. Now we're going to go ahead and move this out of the way. And for the case where the integer is 1, we're going to get the weapon slot called weapon slot 1. And we're going to get highlight animation from that. And we'll drag off of the 1 for our switch and call start icon anim and plug in weapon slot 1 for the weapon slot. We'll plug in the animation for the animation, and we'll plug in start anim, our local variable, for play anim. So I'll go ahead and stick this over here. Now I'd like to go ahead and just copy this. With these nodes highlighted and my mouse cursor down here, Control W will copy and paste it for me. And I'll hook up the switch case 2 up to this, but instead of weapon slot 1, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to drag in weapon slot 2 right here into the highlight animation target. And I need to drag weapon slot 2 in for the weapon slot on start icon anim. Let's go ahead and do this 3 more times since we have 3, 4, and 5. And now we are switching on our slot index and calling start icon anim, which again handles, so we can go ahead and compile. Okay, so I'm getting a compilation failure here in the blueprint. And so it says in use pin new param 1 no longer exists. I'm double clicking on that, and play highlight animation has a error with one of its input parameters. So the easiest way to fix this is to simply drag out play highlight animation and call it with a new fresh node. So I'm going to go ahead and connect these like this and compile, and now it compiles just fine. Okay, so before we test this, there's one last thing we need, and that's our play animation has a target input parameter. That's a user widget object reference. That's going to be our weapon slot. That's our input parameter from start icon anim. We're going to plug that in for target, and now we can go ahead and hit play and hover over a weapon. And now you'll see that we get our icon animation playing. Now if we stop hovering, it'll stop playing, and if we hover over another object, it'll start playing again. Now we can go ahead and pick up an object and highlight another one, and it'll show us now that if we pick this one up, it's going to go into the second slot. And if we pick that up and highlight another one, then it'll show us that that will go into the third. And then we can highlight another, that'll go into the fourth and the fifth, and so on. All that's left, if you want to, is to tweak it. If you don't like the size or the position of these icons, you can go ahead and change those in the animation. So if you want to tweak those, I leave that up to you. So that's going to go ahead and conclude this video and this section. Now next, what we're going to do is work on data tables. So we'll get into data tables in the next video. So I will see you then.